Welcome back to the Paradigm Project. We are here today with two fantastic people. We have Mary Nielsen, who is a Paradigm alumni, and Stephen Barfuss, who used to be a mentor here. So we're going to get to know them a little bit, and then we're going to talk about poetry and how it's involved in the great conversation of ideas. Let's start with you, Mary. How was your experience at Paradigm? Tell us a little bit about what you think.
Paradigm definitely changed the way that I thought about the world. I mean, that's kind of the point. We come here and it's kind of like we show you the world in a different way. But just previously growing up in a very closed religious background and then coming and meeting people of just all different ideas, and there were so many things presented to me in ways that I had never experienced before, and it very genuinely changed the way that I viewed the world,
right.
In a positive way.
Right. Stephen, how about you? How was your experience? Because I know you were a mentor here for quite a while.
Yeah, I taught here for a total of 10 years in an 11-year span. Mm-hmm. And it was a very positive experience. I liked the idea of Paradigm. I've changed a lot. Paradigm's changed a lot, but I can't deny it. A very good and overall beautiful experience for me.
Right. I love that. What kinds of things have you been doing since?
I taught at another school for a year since I taught here. And then for the last year, I've been learning how to work with subconscious programming. So kind of like to help with trauma, helping people reprogram their subconscious patterns.
That's fantastic.
Kind of a coaching practice. Yeah, and it's really fun. A method called MAP method. Another one I do is called internal family systems. It's a beautiful work. Yeah, I like it a lot. Just getting going on that.
That's fantastic. I love that. How about you, Mary?
I have just been working and writing music. I have wanted to get an album out for a long time, but have had a lot of stumbling blocks for it. Most of those stumbling blocks have been me in my own way, but I have been continuing to write music, and I have a lot of songs that I am wanting to share with people and I'm excited about.
I love that. What we want to talk about today is poetry and kind of how it fits into the great conversation. So both of you, I know, were very into poetry in Paradigm's community while you were here. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the experiences that you had while you were here?
Well, I have always had poetry as a big piece of my teaching. I always brought a poem in. I've taught a lot of poetry classes. The last 4 years, I believe I was here, we did a poetry club and we fielded a poetry team the last 3 years. This was slam poetry, long form, spoken word poetry, and the students would get to go compete, and it was awesome. That was one of the coolest things. I saw so many amazing students come through and speak their hearts and really put together something to say. And this poetry club was my highlight of my week for the last couple of years especially. And where, just I felt like I was really communing with these students rather than just being their teacher, right? We were having this experience together.
Right.
And I wrote poetry and shared it, and they wrote way better poetry than me and shared it. And it was fun. It was a good time. And I just feel like a very important piece of the work that I did here.
Right.
I was actually introduced to poetry at Paradigm. Well, I'd always written songs for like a few years before that, and didn't feel like I could do poetry because it was very structured and there was like the all the different rhythms of it, and I didn't really understand it, and my sister was really good at it, and I was like, I'll never be like my sister. Then my first few weeks at Paradigm, I was feeling very alone. I didn't really know how to connect with people yet. And I wrote a poem about it, and I didn't know if it was good, but I came to Barfuss and I gave it to him, and he thought it was amazing, and I just started writing more and more, and I love it. It was amazing.
Right, that's fantastic. And I know I can remember from previous years, times that you've come into my classes, it has been absolutely beautiful.
Mary is a natural poet.
Amen.
She's one of those ones that they breathe poetry.
I love it. I'm a little jealous.
And make poetry happen. It just happens, right? It happens through them. Also a natural performer. So those two things together made
Amen.
Absolutely dangerous. Like the other teams would see them coming to the poetry meet and be like, "Whoa,
Right.
that one's reading. Oh crap!" It was like it was big. Some of her performances and some of her poetry was blew the other coaches away. Didn't always blow the judges away because they're prejudiced.
Yeah.
It's charter schools or something. I don't know. I had several times the other coaches from the other teams come up and like, "Holy crap! How did she not get a better score?" And that happened to us quite a bit, but many times did score well and just was very impressive.
We keep talking about poetry and also community. What are your thoughts on how poetry is such a community thing? And how those two are interlocked?
I definitely experience community at Paradigm through my poetry. I don't write as much poetry now, and partially I think that's because I've changed mediums a little bit, and partially because I don't really have a community that is encouraging that and making those connections in me and thinking, oh, I should write a poem about that,
Right.
In Paradigm, I experienced a lot of community from just my other poets and the other teams that we went and performed with. Like, we weren't performing against them, really. It wasn't a competition. It was us sharing
celebration.
Right.
It was.
I love that.
It was not us competing with each other, and we adored the other poets. At least I did, and I loved experiencing their mind and the way that they express themselves.
Right.
And I feel like the community and poetry are very related, and just language in general,
Right.
and community and the way that we talk to each other and interact with each other and share thoughts is a big part of community.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
A lot of thoughts. The poetry is a natural for community just because it's human beings doing what we want to do most, and that is make meaning of the world in ways that don't have the rules, that don't have the left brain, logical, where people are like, you have to do it this way, or, this makes sense, whatever. You just express the emotions, train your emotions, understand your emotions, understand your thoughts, all those things moving together. So it's us doing the thing that we want to do the most, and that is make meaning of the world. So that's natural for a community. Of course, people come around that. And whether it's song or dance or whatever kind of art and community and culture are woven into each other. And if you don't have art, you don't have community and you don't have culture. When people talk about culture, they're talking about the art of the culture. They're not talking about the logical things or the things they build or, whatever. Those things might figure in there somewhere, but mostly it's how did they think about things? What did they do? What did they do to celebrate the world and themselves? Art and especially poetry has always been a huge centerpiece. Storytelling around the fire in tribes, those kinds of activities have always been the center of culture and therefore the center of community.
How can our listeners implement that kind of culture into their lives?
Well, this gets to the crux of what I want to say today. Can I just spell this thing?
For sure.
I want to say? So, this idea of like, how does poetry fit into the great conversation? Well, the whole equation is backwards. And that is, poetry is the point. Without poetry, without poems, without meaning, nothing else works. The left brain logical stuff is just commentary on the poetry, whatever form that is. The main big stories of civilization are what drives it, and those are poetry. Those are us trying to express in more than words, with words, but more than words, the ineffable things that we want to express as human beings.
Right.
And that's the point of the whole game, right? So this whole point, like, it's part of the great conversation. No. It is the main part of the conversation. Everything else, all your logic, all your philosophy, all your mathematics, all your science is only to make those things go well. So, to turn the conversation, how do those other things support the real game, which is, we could put it in the word poetry, but what we really mean is story. We mean this search for meaning, this the ineffable, the soul part of life. So, this understanding that, the English teacher has to put poetry somewhere and amongst writing the essays and stuff. The essays are bullcrap. That's just like intellectual stuff that we have to do. Logic, all that makes sense. It's great. It's good defense against bad ideas, whatever. But really, we should focus our schools, ourselves, around the art that we produce, the meaning that we're producing. We would have much more coherent systems at that point, because otherwise we're backwards. We're trying to do the put it together thing without the actual understanding ourselves thing, which doesn't work.
Poetry is an expression of soul, like the pure, and we use language to express that because we have dance and we have like painting and we have those other ways of creating soul outside of ourselves. But poetry is through language, and all this logic and this governing and this trying to figure things out only stems from trying to understand poetry, because you don't break poetry apart. That's not the point. The point is to feel it. That is also the point of the great conversation, that you don't figure out what the great conversation is, you experience it. And, trying to logic out poetry just makes it ugly.
The scene in the Dead Poet Society, he takes the graph and, it's like ripping out, he rips out that page. Where he tries to, understand poetry logically is the point of this book. Like, we can deconstruct it like something like material. This gets to the point where poetry now is an art, but poetry particularly. The reason why poetry is potent in the problems that we have right now is that, all these P's going on, I'm just writing poetry as I speak, is that words are both logical and illogical. They ride this line. They're both the most logical thing we can do. We can use words to try to explain and try to reason. But when we use that tool for soul creation or soul understanding by going all the places that we go, right, as humans, in poetry, it gets dark because we have dark. It gets joyous, happy, celebratory because we have that in us too. It goes everywhere that goes, and it tries to understand all that from this big place. So when you're trying to use words to explain the things that words can't get to, you're getting at there. And I think that the Tao is a really good example. The Tao that can be named is not the Tao, right? The poetry that can be explained in these easy terms is not poetry. You're not getting at it, right? Education, in the material sense, is the feeling of pale, so to speak, not the lighting of a fire, as this has been said here often. But we don't really believe that. We want to have this nice little system that works, and everybody goes through the system and look at how much it constructs them. Really, what we need to do is blow them up, right? And that's what I try to do in every poetry class, blow their brains up. That's what every poetry is trying to do. It's the Ray Bradbury quote, every morning I get up and I blow myself up, and then I spend the whole rest of the day putting myself back together, right? That's the thing that we should be doing in classrooms, rather than pretending that we have it all put together and pretending that it's all explained, pretending that all the answers are there if you just think hard enough. It's not true. When we start from there, it doesn't work. When we use that as a tool to make the meaning work, like I said, then it becomes workable.
And I also think that poetry it can be very simple. There are lots of types of poetry, like Mary Oliver is obviously, fantastic poet, one of my favorites. And the way that she writes is so simplistic and yet so powerful and scary almost. We read all these classical books and they're wonderful and I love them, but they're so tied up in all of these fancy words and all of these big ideas. And poetry is intimidating because it attacks your soul in this simple way of like, this is a connection. I have this line to you now. And it hurts to feel because it's so simple and so real and honest. And all the other words are just trying to capture that honesty and build it bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's not the point. It's just that simple.
That's so beautiful. Go, Mary. And the soul poets are my favorite now. You ask people what poetry is and what it does, and you get a lot of different answers. I have a fairly romantic view of poetry, and I have an unapologetic romantic view of poetry. Because in the Romantic period, what they were doing is responding to this materialist modernism, and the world needed balance. That's like the golden age of poetry. We also stopped listening to poets then. We stopped taking poets seriously at some point as the material world became more and more material-oriented, and more, people fought against the religion ideas. And while some of that was justified, they also threw out this wonder and this questioning and these big thoughts in favor of explanation and, putting things together just so, and thinking that we understand everything. And, the science, this kind of unbalanced science. I love science, but without this soul work, science gets completely out of control and starts building things we don't need. That's pretty much describes the world today. We built this marvelous world that's completely unsustainable and terrible, and because we've lost track of our soul, we've lost track of poets. We don't listen to them anymore. Again, we look at in schools, we shove them to the side, to the corner. Like, a lot of English teachers don't even want to teach poetry. I want to teach the real thing. I don't want to teach poetry. And I was appalled by that. Or if I taught a poetry class, it was barely considered an English credit or something. The students have this view of poetry when they come through school, because the way it's taught was very much from this perspective of not the soul thing. It was like, here's poetry, you have to do it, and you have to understand it, and you have to understand it my way, right? And it's like, pinning a butterfly down instead of watching the butterfly fly, and that's cool. We can see the butterfly up close and whatever, but I'd take me a butterfly floating around the room any day rather than this pinned creature. It's been a real disservice.
Does anyone really want to know the answer? Like, truthfully, we have all of the, like we explain everything with science. Knowing the answer is fine because we're trying to label things, and it's easier to understand the world if we box things up and be like, this is how it is and this is how it has been, and it makes sense for our brains. But poetry doesn't answer a lot of things. It usually just leaves you with more questions and a lot of open-ended questions about who you are and what is life and what is nature and all of these things. And I don't want to know the answer. I don't want to have this definitive answer of this is what this is, because then it can't be mine. Then I can't have it.
That's golden. Yeah, absolutely. That getting to the big questions and getting to that way in a way that people feel has been the thing from the beginning. I mean, Western civilization started with the Iliad. And that's, about a bunch of really terrible people who are basically pirates trying to pillage another place. But in that whole thing, they ask these big questions. Like, what is this about? Why are there some gods on one side and some gods on the other side? And why does this all go down like it goes down? Why this crazy, terrible life that has death and terror and loss and pain and what is going on? From the religious texts, from Homer, from so many things, it's very clear that in a healthy society, that is the fuel that really drives everything, is those big, big questions. We want to ask them, and we want to ask them again and again and again. And we don't really want the answers, like you said. Beautiful. I love how you said that. Because really they're individual to each one of us, for one thing. And then also, it's just a fun game. It's better to be looking for the purpose to life than have it. It might be more meaningful to be looking than to decide that you're there. If you decide you've had it, then you become a boring person, and you become intolerable, and you probably become violent because you think and then you're willing to impose those things on other people. If you just were asking the questions, not to say that you don't ever act on them, but you have to come to some practical thing at some point, and that's good. And let's do philosophy there, and let's do science there. Awesome. But really, it's about when you're a person who's asking questions all the time, you're a person who I want to hang out with. You're a person who's really doing the thing, that humans do, rather than having done it. And then now you're dead end, right? Life isn't moving through you anymore once you stop asking the questions, once you think you know. I write a poem every day, at least one, and just for this reason. And I have a question. I wake up, I have a question. Or I can't settle my brain, whatever. I write a poem, and they're usually terrible. But I've got, I'm started to do this on my computer. I've got notebooks and notebooks of my quest to understand things, and I just have questions. And some of those poems are terrible. I don't even think that way. Sometimes a part of me expresses itself into poetry. I'm appalled by it. I'm like, what in the heck is going on there? Right? Heck. What is going on in that one? Holy crap, was that me that wrote that? But it doesn't matter. It's just because there's parts of me that want to express themselves that way, and that's helpful. And it makes me look at it and go, oh, wow, what's going on there? And, constantly questioning myself, constantly questing into that thing. Oh, we got to read, that's a poem we got to read. Oh. Commentary or question?
I remembered one time when I was taking science with Mr. Noxon. And science is a very, or it's thought of as very structured and very like, everything has an answer, And one day we were just sitting there and he was asking, like, how does life know how to create itself more? And, like when animals are born and they just have this innate instinct to do things that, like, spiders are born and they just know how to create webs. No one teaches them that. How does that work? How does life create more of itself, and how does it know these things? And everyone is really confused and they don't know how to answer, and they're trying to explain it in a religious sense, and he's like, no, like, take all of that out. How does the world work this way? And I feel like that question is poetic in its own sense, that taking something that is very structured and like, this is how the world works, and then it's like, how though? And we sat there for a long time in silence because no one knew how to answer that question. And it was frustrating because I wanted to know how to answer it. But it was a very poetic moment to think about, how does life exist and know how to work? It just does, And I think that's like poetry in a way.
It's interesting. What poetry does is get you comfortable with not knowing. Comfortable in that questions place, because I think there's a trauma that students have. Like, they've been tortured by social disgrace, meaning grades, to need to get the right answers. If you have the right answers, you get the good grade, right? If you don't have the right answers, you don't. So, they come into my class or they come into poetry and they're like, how do I write good poetry? Right? And then I don't care if it's good. I write you and then it's good. I've had terrible poetry written that's been beautiful, wonderful stuff, right? When I say terrible, not, aesthetically pleasing, but like pleasing to my soul, because something in this kid wrote that poem. And any poem, I always said, give me your bad poetry. Please come read me your bad poetry. And because it's not. Because if you wrote it, and you wrote it for your own purposes, and that's why I love Poetry Club rather than class, because in class, I had to grade this stuff. Grading poetry is the biggest joke ever, by the way. I'm going to grade your soul, your feeble attempt to express your soul.
Oh my gosh.
How dare you, right? But in Poetry Club, these kids came on their own time, and they wrote on their own time, and they wrote because they had these burning questions, and because they had these big things to say, or they weren't heard. Poetry Club ended up being, usually it's in most schools, it's kind of the outlet for the kids who are marginalized. And this is what poetry does, by the way. It gets us back. It's like a force. And when certain people aren't being respected, or when life isn't being respected, poetry will find a way to speak itself in a way that challenges power and challenges the structures and all sorts of that kind of thing. And that's a fun place for poetry, which is why it's considered chaotic. It's actually not chaotic. It's just a force of nature that seeks balance, and it will come back at you in this really vengeful way that's actually really beautiful. And some of that vengeance is beauty itself. So, where was I going with that whole fun structure there? Woo! Let's read a poem. This is one of my favorite poems. I'd love to read this to my poetry classes. Walt Whitman is like he's a soul fella. And I like the soul poems, I like the people who, those poets who really ask the biggest questions and have the biggest process. And Whitman feels like a brother, or like I'm a reincarnation. I wouldn't say that, but like some of him got into me somehow. Right? When I read him, I'm like, whoa, whoa. How did he know? And it's called The Noiseless Patient Spider, one of his short, really good ones. A noiseless patient spider, I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated. Marked how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding, it launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached, in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor fold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere. Oh, my soul. Some normal guy walks around the forest and he sees a spider on it. He's like, oh, there's a spider. Right? Walt Whitman sees a spider. He's like, oh, my soul. And everything is our soul, right? Everything is our soul. And that's what poetry knows, that art knows, that other things don't know. Everything is a part of you, and you are a part of everything. So when you see someone acting in a way that you don't like, and you comment on it, this is you commenting on you in a way. It's all this common humanity, and you're questioning that piece that's happening there. And you might hate that. You might write a poem hating something. Beautiful. Hate is a thing that humans do. We should write poems in hate. We should write poems in love. We should write poems about hate and about love, right? So all these things get explored. Filament, filament, filament. Imagine the spider just throwing things out there, throwing words out there, trying to attach the different ideas, the different worlds, and maybe never succeeding. Maybe some of those filament, most of those filaments just go out there, but something for that individual is going to hold and it's going to attach, and that's what we do. That's what we do as humans. That's the fun, and then we follow those threads and see where they go, and that leads to somewhere else, and that leads to somewhere else, and that leads to somewhere else. Yeah.
Poetry has such potential, like in the way that you're talking about the filament, and we throw ourselves out there. And I've written so many poems that have different metaphors, and each metaphor kind of is almost a life that I've lived in that poem, and I read it and I feel like that I am that thing again. You know, I have a poem about a spaceman, and I am that spaceman. You know, and and then whenever I think about that, I have all of these potential lives or potential oh my souls and all of the things that I see. And poetry makes your world bigger in that sense, that you are not just you. You are the spider, or you are the filament, or you're the forest, or you are the lake encompassing the forest, and or you're the man, and it's everything. It's not just you and your little soul. It's you and everything, and that soul is connected everywhere.
You know what I'd love to do? I'd love to have Mary recite one of their poems.
I would love that also, please.
Okay.
I want a case, just for what we were talking about, I want a case in point.
Yeah.
From a practical perspective. That's not Walt Whitman.
I actually really want to read this one that I think I only showed it to like one person before because I didn't really like it, and then I showed it to him and I was like, wow, I really like this now. I wrote it because I was laying in the grass trying to grapple the silence. I was trying to experience it and not push it away. And I just kept pushing it away because it was making me uncomfortable. I couldn't stand sitting in the grass with my own thoughts. It was physically hurting my brain. And so I wrote a poem about it. And this is the thing that came out of it. So I can stand the silence a little longer. I can let it pitter-patter its way across my bare stomach, stretching my timed breaths until I hold them, thinking the next will be easier. It's not. The silence wants me. It wants me to be its lover. It wants to be cradled and held for longer. My first date with silence was 2 years ago. We laid in the schoolyard grass and felt things a little too strong. Now silence wants to get married. For quiet or for chaos, in sickness and in health, to breathe in and to cherish, though uncomfortable, till song do us part. I want to marry the silence and have mere whispers of children. I want to feel its arms wrap around my broken frame and fill in the empty spaces with that sound. You know, the sound that silence says, the beckoning, the wishful thought penetrating, the space between I and love and you, that song that silence sings. Listen. Now listen again, but stop thinking about listening. I can stand the silence just a little longer. I can feel my pain a little farther. I can let my thoughts just be whatever the outcome. I don't know if you knew this, but trees are fluent in silence. Why do you think they don't talk? It's not that they don't have anything to say. They just feel instead of speak. I can stand the silence a little longer. Yes, I can stand the silence, the question of love, and the answer, whether it be what I want or not. I stand with patience. I stand. Now listen. There it is. There's the silence.
Woo! I don't want to say anything else.
Just enjoy.
Ruin it. Yeah, man, these questions and these experiences that are so interesting and so deep and so relatable. So funny that somebody can have this experience with silence, and I'm like,
yeah.
Right? And that's the beauty of it. And at the same time, mine's a little different, but it's just enough that I can see it, and I can just really feel that with you. And that's one thing I think that Mary has always done well in her poems, is brought the people in, they're having this wild experience in their head, right? And you would think it would be like, sometimes it's like, what in the world is going on? And at the same time, like, oh, that's going on here too. And that really, that's really wonderful when when Mary used to go around the school reading their poems for practice, right? The next day, I would inevitably get flooded with poems. Like, I heard Mary read. And I had to go write. I had to go write, right? Because that experience that they're having with the poetry, right, is the thing that humans want most. We want to be in that process of really feeling that. Why is it that poetry is seen as destabilizing force? Why is it seen as this wild thing? People with long hair and wild minds who do drugs and, have questionable personal practices do, right? And that's been the case, right? Your Jim Morrisons, your crazy wild poet types. And it's because society hasn't been doing that. And when we need it, we get these brains that come at us with the process, with the thing, right? The way I think of humanity is we're all one big ecosystem and we're all connected and energy knows what it's doing, right? This whole process is one big process. You can question that and you can say, Barfuss, you're crazy, whatever. But I feel like this. And so when we need a certain type of thinking, we get that kind of thinker. And it's never what the establishment wants. It's never comfortable. And sometimes that shows up in an unhealthy way, right? It can be that edgy unhealthiness. And I don't think it has to be that way. If we embraced poetry the way that we embrace science, and we saw it as a valid way of thinking, right? Like from the beginning, where, a kid is good at science and we say, oh, good job, kid. You're going to make a ton of money. You're going to be awesome. Kid's good at poetry and we're like, that's awesome. I don't know what to do with you. There's no good high-paying jobs for those poets. It should be the highest paid thing, right? We should have poet millionaires and billionaires who are doing poetry things and doing the thing that humanity really wants. And why don't we have that? Why don't we have our values there? Because it's impossible to control. That's why.
I remember when I was in your nature and adventure class, I think it was that time anyway, that I came to you and said that I didn't want to go in nature in general because it made me too honest and I wasn't ready to look at myself. That going out and being with the woods is attacking a real piece of me, and I had too many layers on at that point, and I knew that it would shave them off, kind of like Aslan in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when he shaves off Eustace's scales. I love that story. And it gets him down to his bare human again. And nature does that to me. And it's scary. And I'm afraid because, not that I'm afraid of who I am, but I'm afraid to be loved unconditionally by nature and by myself because I don't believe that I have value. But that's just a face that I've put on, that I don't believe that I have value. Because underneath, that person that's in nature knows that and knows that it's real and loves me despite it. But that face that I kind of have on constantly gets just taken off. And poetry does that. And that's why people don't like it. Because it's too honest. It's too real and genuine. And it's too scary.
It's too much. And I love that because the systems that control have built into us the fear of being ourselves, really loving ourselves. Because if we really love ourselves, I like to quote, who was it? So there's an early educator that was part of the modern system. John Gatto quotes him. I'm trying to remember the name, but they said in a letter about the modern education system, if we alienate students from themselves, we'll have a better world because then we can control them. And this is the whole idea of behaviorism, right? The whole idea of behaviorism, which was the idea on which modern education was built, that if you just run people through the correct system, you can control them. And then when we control everybody and everybody can control each other, and we just have really good people controlling us, this goes back to the Republic and all that, then we'll just have this great world, right? That's a painful world. So, you are the product of systems of control, to the point where you're sitting there in my nature class going, I know, and this is, Mary is so in tune with their selves that they know this is coming, right? And most students aren't. They're just apprehensive kind of it, like, I don't know what this will do. What if it blows me up? Yay! Let's blow ourselves up today. Not a popular opinion from most schools, you know. Mr. Barfuss, have you been blowing students up again? Why, yes. No. I wouldn't do that. I'm not, no. Just order here. Just grades. Essays. Write on essays, students.
In a world where you have everything controlled, when you alienate people from themselves, there is no passion. There is no love and passion and excitement for creation. And you can control people, but eventually it's going to stop. Eventually, like, progress will halt, and someone has to find themselves, or there has to be a new generation, or whatever, but you can't keep doing it, because people find themselves eventually, whether they've been alienated from themselves or not, you know? And the world, and even, you know, just general society needs passion, whether they like to believe that they need it or not, you know? Like, we're not machines. We build machines to do those things for us, and now we're stuck trying to grapple with ourselves because everything is done for us, and we are useless, you know? But at a general level, at a fundamental core level, we are just infinite worth. You know, all of those things that we're trying to name ourselves and be, I am this, and I am a part of the society, and we're just potential. We are just ourselves. Society can't take that from us eventually, you know?
Can't. And when it does, there are energies produced, like Mary and many others who serve to work the other way, right? To make it so that it can't be, I mean, you can't control this. You can't. The revolution always happens in art first, and then it happens elsewhere. And when there's kind of a consensus of how that's going to go. But we could make this process a lot better, again, by arts get sidelined. They're seen as impractical. And to me, that's just the most crazy backward thinking. You want to create soulless people who do the things that you think are productive. Why are they productive? They have to meet a need at some point, but we don't even know who we are. And the less we know who we are, then the more things can be foisted on us, and we become good little consumers. We don't ask too many questions. That makes a lot of people a lot of money. Soulless individuals are easily nobody's soulless. The people who are out of touch with their soul are easily manipulated, and people who are alive in this sense, who've been, who activate themselves into this aliveness that is these questions, that is this process. By the way, this is not to denigrate science. This is not to denigrate philosophy. This is not to denigrate that. We need that. We need to figure out the practical details and how to think through these things. But we also need the other, and we're way imbalanced right now in this horrible way. Even our art is fairly packaged, mostly, where poetry is not, packageable. I don't know. It's harder to maintain that way.
It's boundless.
It's harder to control. Yeah.
Is there a way that we can make it more balanced?
So they did this fun experiment where they took these students and they had them read a poem, and they did a poem each day for I don't know how many days, but I can't remember. I have to cite the study, but it's been a while since I've seen it. But they had them take out the poem like every hour and read this poem. So a different poem every day. And it was astounding. One of the weird things that happened is their math scores went up. Right? You wouldn't think that was the case. Well, here's the thing. When you're engaged in your soul, everything else is there. Everything else is motivated. When you're here, when you're really asking and successfully negotiating your soul, then everything else is interesting, or can be. I'm interested in everything to a huge fault, right? Like, I'll never study all the things that I want to study. I'll never get to the end of it. And, my study is the soul. Currently, that's what I'm fascinated by, and poetry is a huge part of that. But this getting to that, creating that environment where that's safe and beautiful, and there's people there that know how to do that in this way that's not religious or secular, that is in this place where we can ask those big questions and feel free to be wrong, and feel free to express what's there and not have that judged, would be a beautiful start. And so, read frickin' poetry in the schools. Read it. Have a poetry club. Have 3 poetry clubs. It's not everybody's gig. I don't know. Do something really gets to that soul place and make that the center of your education and build everything else around it. That's what I advise. And the more we get away from that, the worse we're doing, in my view, of education. And so to facilitate this, we pretty much have to blow up the whole system because it's completely run on the other thing now. Get the right answers. We're judged by that stupid test, and that's just a symptom of the philosophy. The philosophy is rotten. So get rid of that. Let's do soul work. It doesn't have to be religious. Doesn't have to question anybody's religion. Well, actually, it has to question everybody's religion, but in the nicest way, right? We're not trying to ruin the way that people think or that families think. We're providing facilitating a process of deep self-questioning and understanding, and we can do that very respectively. Yes, respectively, but also respectfully. Yes.
I remember. My first and only simulation that I ever did, we go to have the after discussion for, what we think everything was and how it affected us and made us think differently. And I remember at the very beginning of it, Fife was leading it, and he said something that has truly changed the way I view a lot of things. But he said, if you have an idea and you put it out into the circle and it doesn't hold up, don't fight for it. It doesn't make that idea wrong or terrible, or it doesn't make you bad for suggesting it. But if it doesn't hold up, don't fight for it, because the more you fight for it, you're just going to get angrier, and it's not, you're going to derail the conversation. It's not going to work. And in the same way, we have these ideas, and poetry isn't meant to be answered, and we write bad poems, and we have, you write those poems a day, and some of them are things that you did not expect to come out of you. And some of it's angry, and some of it's violent and just hateful. And those pieces are not meant to just be discarded, just because they exist. They might not be the right thing for that moment. It might not hold up against everything. But it's still you, and it's still a piece of you that needs to be learned and loved. And I think that's what poetry is.
That gets to my current work of parts work, and it's just all parts. And we're not one personality. We're a lot of different personalities, and we're a lot of different parts that are working together. This word harmony comes to me a lot, right? We want harmony. To get harmony, though, we really need to explore ourselves and understand ourselves. When we're trying to force things, that doesn't ever create harmony, right?
And you have to let the other parts of you sing as well. You can't just say, you exist here,
yes.
And I see you, but I won't let you speak because your opinion or your voice doesn't matter. All of the parts of you deserve to be heard, even the ugly parts, and especially the ugly parts, because underneath them is just pain.
Totally. And reading and letting some of that out, right? You write poetry sometimes that is very painful, and I write poetry sometimes that is very painful for others to read, and that's exactly the point. It's not supposed to be fun, but it also trains the beautiful parts, right? When you read poetry by some of these great writers, one way or another, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I love Emily Dickinson's I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, because it's an ugly poem. It's a terrible thought, This person's dying and they hear this fly buzz, and it's this last thing. I probably don't have time to read it, but it's like this is ugly situation. It's terrible. At the end, I'm like, oh, but yeah, that's a thing. Maybe there's not anything. Maybe it's not some big transcendental thing. Maybe it's just, and you're dead. and that's something to consider. I don't believe it's that way. On the other hand, I read some of these the great soul poets, the Mary Olivers and the David Whites. These ones that just they really get there into this way. And theirs isn't all pretty either, but it's so there's these high ideas and high ideals that really sing to me as well. And I feel like those parts get trained. So I write all sorts of poetry. Sometimes I write devotional poetry. Sometimes I write really practical, ranty poetry. And sometimes just whatever needs to come out. Man, if everybody was taught to do that as a basis of their education, just to explore their soul in that way. And, art class does that to some degree. But again, it's all kind of packaged and put together in this way that's not as personal as it could be. And there's a place for discipline. There's a place for learning the words and understanding rhyme and understanding there's a place for discipline in the art for sure. But there's more of it's just like being with it, doing it, making space for it.
Right. So, unfortunately, we have to wrap up a little bit. This has been an absolutely amazing discussion, but we do end all of our podcasts with a challenge and a takeaway. So, Mary, if you could give us a takeaway, and then we'll get our challenge from you, Barfuss, that would be fantastic.
I feel like I learn things from myself and you all the time.
That's what a good session is, yeah.
I think one of the things that I was thinking about a lot is just not naming things, so that it can be mine and so that we can connect to each other on all of these different levels. And because we are an ecosystem, I love that word, that we all exist in the same, we're all working in the same patterns and ideas. And honestly, a big takeaway is that I want to write more poetry. I have really stopped doing it for a while. Been writing music, which is poetry in a very different form, but poetry gives me something that music does not, and that is it attacks a very specific part of me, and music kind of makes that part of me pretty, and poetry is just, here is this ugly piece of you that you should love, and then I love it with music, and so it makes me excited to go write some more.
My challenge is going to be, I'm going to say something very general, and then I'll give something very specific. I think generally, I would say, and I don't know how, this is going to come off to people who, I'll just say it. The game is a search for soul. And how I define that is not mystical. The search for soul is you finding who you are in relationship to everything else. And it doesn't need to be mystical. It can be, right? But it doesn't have to be. You can imagine the world and the universe however you want to imagine it, or however you discover it. And but your relationship with everything else, and from your very essence. So whatever work it is that gets you to your very essence, and that might be sport, or it might be, I don't know what it is, but for that soul work is so important. Poetry is a really beautiful part of that, and poets have explored the human condition from the very highs to the very lows and in between. Finding a poet you like, any poet, it could be Shel Silverstein, or music can do it to some degree. Music can be poetry, but there's something about, like Mary said, something about poetry just as an art form itself, just words on a page or words spoken, that creates its own environment, and that's a beautiful place to be. So pick up a poet that you like. Go to poets.org, or go to another site. You can go into the popular poetry site that people publish on. I don't care. It doesn't have to be great stuff. Just go read. Read a poem every day for 30 days. See what happens to your brain. Put a poem in your pocket. Read it every hour. See what happens, right? See if you feel yourself differently, and you will. I can get you a list. A great list is on Poetry 360. There's a great list of poems. The idea is reading a poem every day of the year, and they've kind of curated this list of really good poems. It's really beautiful. I use that all the time in my poetry classes, Poetry 360. So go and read a poem every day, and maybe sit down on a page, and forget everything you know about writing poetry. Every bad lesson you've had, or good lesson you've had, and breathe deep. And see what comes. See what the words there are for you. See what happens. Maybe everything, maybe nothing.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and for sharing. And thank you to our listeners to come in and listen to us. This has been an absolutely fantastic episode. I know that I have learned a whole lot about myself and about poetry and about the world and even the great conversation of ideas. Thanks for listening to The Paradigm Project. Please rate us 5 stars on iTunes, and we have a Q&A on Spotify if you'd like to answer that. If you want to get into contact with us, you can email us at podcast@paradigmhigh.org or DM us on Instagram at @theparadigmpod. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to engage in the great conversation of ideas.